just can't see the path before me. The melody cries out like a beacon I can hear but can't see. So I know where to go. I find the answers to the questions in my life from the music in my head.
Welcome to the Resilient Insights podcast. I'm your guide on this journey, Joshua Baca, walking you through the intricate world of public policy, leadership, and the lighter side of life. On today's episode, I'm joined by Florida political operative Jamie Miller. Jamie is going to walk us through the political dynamics shaping the state of Florida, the somewhat competitive race for the U.S. Senate, races for Congress that could determine control of the U.S. House of Representatives, and so much more. Jamie, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Jamie, why don't we start off by telling us a little bit about your background?
Yeah, I've been involved in Florida politics for about 30 years. I'm a veteran of the Florida 2000 election recount. I was director of field operations for the Republican Party of Florida in the George W. campaign during both the election and the recount. I was a senior advisor in Florida to Newt Gingrich's presidential campaign. And I've also run races in North Carolina, Mississippi, West Virginia, and throughout mostly the Southeast.
I wanted to start off with the big picture. You mentioned 2000. Florida was a battleground state won by President George W. Bush by
37.
537 votes. We're looking at a presidential race today where Florida does not seem to be contested. It's no longer a battleground state. What has happened in Florida over the last 20 years that has made this new reality come into place?
For one thing, it's good governance. When I first became involved in politics, Florida was a Democrat-controlled state, conservative Democrat, but Democrat nonetheless. After 1998, Republicans have controlled the governor's mansion, the cabinet, the state house, and the state senate. And then we've had periods where there have been a supermajority within both the state house and state senate during that time. So we've been able to, the long slog is Florida's a case study for how conservatism can work in a large state, a large economy, but also how long it takes for government to really make changes. Jeb Bush was the education governor, was seen for years as the Republican education governor, and we're still making strides, making education more accessible to parents, giving more parental choice. When Jeb was first elected in 1998, it's a lifetime ago now, but when he was elected in 1998, we all strived for those things. And we thought, well, they can happen overnight. So we then, but it takes time. It takes time to move elected officials. It takes time to move staff. It takes time to move the electorate, so people don't like to jump in the deep end of the pool with both feet.
So what are voters expecting on the ballot this November? What's the state of play? What are you seeing on the ground? What are people in Florida voting on this year if there's no competitive race for the presidency?
There's always a possibility that it'll come into play just because of Florida's history, and Democrats keep saying that even this past weekend. In the middle of recovery of a major hurricane hitting the state, they sent out press releases saying that Florida was in play, and they're making this huge investment of $400,000 into Florida. And so, and I know, and probably most of your viewers know that $400,000 buys you about a week of TV on one cable news station in the state of Florida. You have to put that in perspective. You can get one local TV station in Tampa and one local TV station in Orlando, just the news, for about a week for $400,000 in Florida. So you might have to throw in a Jacksonville or a Fort Myers in there to hit 400,000, but you're not moving the state's electorate with a $400,000 investment. But there's also a couple of other reasons Florida's not in play. One is U.S. Senator Rick Scott. He has what I call the Bill Nelson effect. He usually hovers around 49 or 50% approval rating and gets reelected. And one of the reasons why is he's always willing to put his personal money where his mouth is. He's not going to get outspent in an election, and he's certainly not going to get outspent in this one. Rick Scott provides Donald Trump a little bit of a firewall in Florida. But I think the undercurrent that your listeners may be interested in, the Democrat Party chairman made a fatal strategic error back in June. And that was, we have 160 legislative seats, 140 are up this election. And she decided to file Democrats in all 140 of them. And while at first glance, that thinks, we'll make every race
Everything
competitive.
competitive.
what you're doing is providing Republicans that have a vast majority, a super majority in at least one chamber, the ability to raise money, talk about local issues, and turn out the vote. If Rick Scott's not the firewall in the state, certainly local legislative districts will carry the day for both Rick Scott and Donald Trump in Florida. Florida is a pipe dream for 2024. I don't know that it will stay a safe seat for in 2026. We can have a conversation later about that, but I think that it could bounce back to Democrats winning some statewide races in 2026. 2024 is pretty much off the table for them this year.
How significant, like many New Yorkers or many folks in the Northeast, they transplant back to Florida for warmer weather and lower taxes. Former President Trump is now a permanent resident of Florida. How much has that added to making the state not competitive? How popular is he in the state?
What we found is traditionally retirees moved to Florida when they retired. If they were Republicans or Democrats, they moved in equal numbers. The New Yorkers who moved here, the percentage who moved here were about the percentage of Democrats and Republicans of New York.
Right.
So more Democrats than Republicans. If they moved to the West Coast, normally we follow our interstates down. So Ohio, Indiana usually settle on the Gulf of Mexico side. New Yorkers, New Jersey tend to be on the Atlantic Ocean side of Florida. What we've seen since COVID is that more people can choose where they work. And the people who are moving from those states tend to be conservative leaning folks who are fleeing the heavy hand of government in both California, New York, Illinois, and a lot of the blue states. So it's not necessarily blue voters moving here. It's red voters from blue states.
Interesting. So you guys have some ballot initiatives on the ballot this November, one on the legalization of marijuana, one on abortion. How are those dynamics playing out, and what's the status of those ballots?
I think when you start seeing polling that suggests that Rick Scott is in trouble or Donald Trump or Kamala Harris is close to Donald Trump in Florida, most of those polls are considering these ballot initiatives and adding a +2 or +3 Democrat advantage in turnout. I don't see that here on the ground. Certainly people are talking about it, but most people, it's a foregone conclusion. Marijuana especially is virtually legal in our state now. You know, this would make it legal for recreation. You simply go into one side of what used to be a 7-Eleven and see a doctor, and you go into the next side by pot. The medical portion of it, I don't see a whole lot of excitement. Of course, the governor has come out against both these amendments. The Republican Party of Florida has come out against both of these amendments. The devil is in the details on both of them. Trulieve is driving the medical marijuana because it basically sets up a monopoly for them in the state, is the argument. It takes away the penalty for marijuana, but you still can't grow your own plants. You still have to buy your marijuana from Trulieve. There's a little bit of sleight of hand on that amendment. The abortion amendment is a reaction to our legislature passed an abortion measure that gestation be 14 weeks. And then about 2 sessions ago, they passed a 6-week abortion ban. Many people felt like 6 weeks was too extreme. The issue with that ballot initiative is a reaction to the legislature being too extreme on 6 weeks, in some people's opinion. But this ballot amendment is probably too extreme for Florida. It doesn't really define viability. All of this will have to be implemented in the legislature, regardless of whether the abortion measure passes. I think the legislature will dial it back, because the way it reads, you could have full-term abortions, which I think most people disagree with, unless it's the life of the mother. But most people, I think, at least disagree about that.
And from what I understand, Governor DeSantis and the GOP party are actively working to turn out voters against both initiatives. Is that correct?
That is true.
What about the Senate race going on? You talked a little bit about Rick Scott providing that firewall for Donald Trump. What's the status of the race between Rick Scott and Debbie Macrucell Powell? Did I pronounce that correct? Al. There we go. Yeah.
Okay.
Um,
So to be honest with you, you're the first person in any podcast press or anything who has even mentioned her name. The race is 100% about Rick Scott, whether you like him or hate him, much like the race for Donald Trump. Rick Scott has been remembered as a very active governor, a proactive governor when it came to hurricanes. He's being very proactive on the scene, ensuring federal help in damaged areas. And my experience is when we've had these hurricanes hit, this one hit a little bit early, so that maybe the last 2 weeks of the campaign, you might see some adjustment in some of these numbers. As a general rule, when you have a hurricane hit at this juncture in a campaign, it usually freezes the race. And so Rick Scott and Donald Trump are both up 5 to 8 points. I think they'll remain up 5 to 8 points for at least the next 2 to 3 weeks. Polling may not show that because it's hard to poll people after a hurricane. Polling gets a little squishy, but the reality is that the race kind of gets frozen in time. You can apply that same effect to Western North Carolina or to a good portion of Georgia, where when you're hit with this, you're really stop worrying about an election. You start worrying about clean water and cleaning out your house and getting your next meal. I mean, there's some real issues following a hurricane, and so folks, they tune out the election, they tune into real life.
Yeah. It seemed like last week the DCCC said that they were making some investments in Florida. Is that the $400,000 you were mentioning?
The 400,000 that I heard was for Harris campaign.
For the Harris campaign.
I don't know that there's going to be a whole lot of movement in congressional races unless they're trying to shore up incumbents that may be vulnerable. I think most of Florida's congressional races are set. Most of that was whether it's good or bad. We can certainly have that argument of when you have redistricting, that you kind of have dark pink districts and dark blue districts. So they pretty much get set in stone. There's one Democrat held district south of Orlando that Darren Soto's district that the DCCC probably has to invest a little bit of money in to make sure. I don't expect that to flip red, but you and I like to talk about budgets and the importance of money in politics. So you may see money flow into that district just to ensure that they hold on to it. There's a couple of districts down in Miami that everybody always gets excited about, and then they end up regressing to the mean.
When you look at the Cook political report, there are no races in Florida for Congress that are labeled in the toss-up category. And you have two races, Representative Luna and Representative Salazar, who are in the likely Republican category. So any insights on those races in particular?
I think they both stay red for the same reason I mentioned for Rick Scott and Donald Trump. I think it was a major mistake by Democrat Party Chair Nikki Fried to go after every Republican incumbent. It allows them to raise money and talk about local issues. And that just leads right into a reelection for congressional campaigns. If those two could have come into play, it's Nikki Fried's fault that they didn't.
Interesting. Looking ahead, I wanted to talk a little bit about 2026 and the upcoming legislative session. And why don't we start off with the legislative session first? What's on the horizon post-election in the legislature in Florida? And what should corporations or coalitions or trade associations be looking at when it comes to the legislative cycle?
It's always in insurance, right? Insurance education. It's not much different than everywhere else. When you get past home insurance here and commercial insurance, it's a tough market, especially after a couple of hurricanes. We had, flooding from Debbie. Here in Sarasota, we had 18 inches of rain in 72 hours, much like Asheville, North Carolina saw with Helene. We saw the storm surge with Helene up and down from Naples all the way around the Big Bend to Apalachicola Bay. It was a devastating storm on the coast. That's certainly going to be the major issue this legislative session.
When you look at the 2026 race for governor, what are the early prognostications of that? Who are the potential candidates?
The potential candidates are hashtag everyone.
Everyone
wants to be governor. So I've written in my Substack Reasonable Arguments that, 2026 is a little bit of an Achilles heel for Republicans, and I'm, former executive director of the party. So I like to say we need to be careful, because I like to look at history to be our guide. When we've had Democrats win during this last 24-year period, they've won because they ran a female. They did not have a primary, and Republicans did. There is a formula for Democrats to win in an off-year election. And I know that we like to say, well, we've added 1 million voters. We have a 1 million voter cushion, which is about an 8% advantage in registration. And I like to look at the 1990 race where Jim Smith won Secretary of State. He was a Republican. He wasn't female, but he did not have a primary. Democrats did. And he won a statewide office with about an 8% voter disadvantage. So it certainly can be done in Florida. It's not cheap. It has to be very strategic on Democrats' side to try to break through that registration disadvantage. But I think if Republicans take it for granted that Democrats could win a race or two.
And who are some of the early candidates thinking about running? I know you mentioned everybody, but are there any
Yeah, so
front runners?
I think you have to look at the cabinet members who have won statewide for sure.
Okay.
Marco Rubio is always kind of mentioned. You're based out of DC. Of course, that would upend a little bit of what's going on in the US Senate. He's always kind of in the conversation. Other members of Congress who are in the conversation include Byron Donalds, Matt Gaetz, Congressman Walz. There's no shortage of, and then you start talking about either speakers or former presidents in our state House and state Senate. Ben Albritton, who will be the outgoing Senate president, would be a formidable choice. State Senator Joe Gruters, who's been a huge advocate of Donald Trump, has filed for a statewide position we have in Florida called CFO.
And while you're on the Republican side, what about on the Democratic side? Are there any names being floated out there?
No
Early
good
contenders?
ones. No good ones. No, I kind of expect a little bit of a Hail Mary, not a Hail Mary, but a real possibility is a name that many people know around the country, a trial attorney named John Morton out of the Orlando area. He would have the financial means. He's led both the medical marijuana initiative and the recreational marijuana initiative statewide. He was a big contributor of Charlie Crist when Charlie Crist ran for governor and won in 2006. So he's not new to politics, right? He has the wherewithal and support to clear the decks on the Democratic side to have that no primary situation that would put them in a position that they might be able to win that seat. Once you get past him, you start thinking of other captains of industry. There's a state attorney down in Palm Beach County, Dave Ehrenberg. I haven't really heard his name, but I think he would be formidable. There's several members of the state House and state Senate that probably aren't well known by your listeners at this point, but I imagine they will kick the tires on many of those. We have 3 cabinet positions, governor and lieutenant governor. My guess is that they'll kick the tires on that as well.
You know, you mentioned Marco Rubio. Marco Rubio has been presidential candidate, rumored vice presidential candidate, maybe rumored to serve in a potential Donald Trump administration. What would his candidacy be like for governor? Would he basically clear the field?
I don't think so. It's an interesting dynamic in any state when somebody goes from a federal office to a state office. You have folks who feel like they're in the food chain of the state, climbing up the ladder, so to speak. For Marco Rubio, I think would be that broom handle in the bicycle spokes of some candidates. I think that he would give a lot of people pause and probably get some people to reconsider. I think there's probably 2 or 3 who are going to run regardless.
Got it. Looking ahead to November, what are your early predictions? Will the races for Senate and the president be called before 10 Eastern?
In Florida, yes.
And your predictions will be
Trump and Scott for sure. I don't see any indication that either Harris or Powell are making any type of real headway, whether that's polling or on the ground. I don't want to say there's not enthusiasm on the Democratic side, but there's not a lot.
There's not a lot of momentum. You're obviously based in Florida. For those of us who've been following the news, there's been a tropical storm and a hurricane that hit the state of Florida. How are folks doing in Florida today? What's the impact of that on the political races?
If you haven't gone through this, whether you're negatively impacted by a storm or not, you're emotionally impacted. Your friends, your family, your church, your whatever community network you have. I have a client, I'm trying to take a report around on a boat to see some damage, and nobody has a boat. Boats aren't available like
Right now.
usually on a Monday afternoon. It's like, oh, everybody has a boat. And the people who have boats, their lifts have shorted out. So they haven't had a chance to fix them yet. The boat clubs are not open yet. So the rental facilities, marinas are not open. So you just run into snafus with things you take for granted, right? Every restaurant, every grocery store has power. They weren't flooded. but they're, I don't, we have Publix grocery stores here.
Yeah.
Publix subs are a huge deal in Florida. Publix ran out of bread in 3 of their delis. It was a big grill this weekend of trying to find Publix subs and just little things you take for granted that come about. Part of that's because people can't get to work, whether their car got damaged, they're rained in, or they're dealing with a tree through their house. So there's all these dynamics that come into play. There's real damage and people are facing real problems, but even those who aren't face kind of the survivor's guilt of, what can I do to help? In our house, we have very little damage, but we had 5 people from Siesta Key who we knew were vacationing stay in our house for 4 days. So it's like, okay, now all of a sudden you have a Christmas full of people in your house with about 12 hours and a little glimpse of how life turns upside down for at least a week or 2 for everybody affected.
That's good to know that you guys are doing well. I know the country's watching, and for all of us who we've had rain here in the DC area, but nothing like the state of Florida. Hoping you and your family and your friends and your colleagues are all doing well.
We're resilient. We'll be back, and your favorite vacation spot in Florida will be up and running soon.
You guys have a proven model on how to recover from these types of storms. I have no concerns there. Jamie, we always do this for guests of the Resilient Insights podcast. We like to curate a playlist of songs that are your favorite songs that either have some sort of meaning in resilience or something you listen to on a regular basis. What's that song for you today? For Jamie Miller.
My wife took me to Vegas to see the Killers in concert. How about Mr. Brightside?
That's a great song. We'll make sure to add that to the playlist. Jamie, we appreciate you being on the show today. Where can people find you? You have a great Substack with some information. Why don't you give everybody a plug for your websites, your social media, all that?
On nearly every social media platform, RepJam, REPJAM. I've written a book you can find on Amazon, American Speeches That Changed History. And my Substack is at Reasonable Arguments, or you can find me www.reasonableargumentswithplural.com.
That's great. Well, Jamie, thank you for the great insights today on the Florida political dynamics. We're obviously still watching closely. While races may not be contested, Florida does, set a lot of precedent for the country. We'll be watching the initiative, the races for Congress and the Senate, and probably a question of not if Donald Trump wins, but by how much he wins come November in Florida. So we'll keep an eye on that and very much appreciate your insights today.
The over-under on that is 4.8%. If you're a betting man.
I'm going to take the over on that one.
I thought I might set it a little low, but I think I probably would. If it's at 4.8, I'd probably take the over as well.
Yeah, I'd take the over on that one. Well, I appreciate it, Jamie. Thank you so much for your time. And thanks to all of our listeners for listening. We appreciate you. Be sure to check out our podcast wherever you get your podcasts. We're available on Spotify and Apple Music. We're also available on YouTube. Please be sure to give us a 5-star rating and a review and share with your friends and tell them a little bit more about the Resilient Insights podcast. So until next time, Jamie, thanks for your time.
My pleasure.
When I'm lost and I just can't see the path before me, the melody cries out like a beacon.